There is a quiet moment that happens after you share a dream out loud. It is small, almost invisible. Someone nods. Someone smiles. Someone says, "That's amazing." And for a second, you feel lighter, seen, validated, important. But later, when you are alone again, something feels different. The fire that once burned in your chest does not feel as intense. The urgency softens. The dream, which once felt sacred and private, now feels exposed, like a fragile flame placed in the wind. Why does that happen? Why do some dreams grow stronger in silence, while others wither the moment they are spoken? This is not a story about superstition. It is a story about human nature, about the strange psychology of ambition, and about the quiet power of restraint. In a small coastal town, far from the noise of big cities, there lived a young architect named Elias. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He spent his days drafting plans for other people's houses, clean, predictable designs that followed rules he did not create. But at night, when the town grew silent and the waves became the only sound outside his window, he worked on something else. He was designing a building no one had asked for. It was bold, unusual, a structure shaped not by tradition, but by imagination. Curved where others were straight. It opened to the sky where others closed themselves off. It was impractical by conventional standards, and yet to Elias it felt alive. He never told anyone about it. For months he guarded the sketches like secrets. He would roll them up carefully, hide them behind a loose wooden panel in his studio wall, and return to his ordinary commissions in the morning. There was a certain sweetness in that secrecy. The dream belonged only to him. It was untouched by opinion, unmeasured by doubt. But one evening, after too much wine and too much encouragement from friends who complained about their predictable lives, Elias made a mistake. He spoke. "I'm working on something different," he said, trying to sound casual. "Something that could change the way we build." They leaned in. They asked questions. He described the curves, the open spaces, the way light would move through the structure like water through a canyon. His hands moved as he spoke. His voice grew louder. By the end of the night, he felt triumphant. They applauded him. They called him visionary. One friend even said, "You're going to be famous." And for a moment, that was enough. The next morning, he woke up strangely satisfied, as if he had already achieved something. The urgency to return to his hidden sketches was weaker. He still loved the idea, but the hunger had softened. Days passed before he touched the plans again. When he finally did, something had changed. The building no longer felt purely his, felt observed, judged, compared to the expectations he had unintentionally created. He began to imagine what his friends would think about certain design choices. Would they understand the open roof? Would they think it impractical? Would they still call him visionary? The dream had shifted from an inner pursuit to a performance. And with that shift, its power began to fade. This is the paradox few people talk about. When we speak our ambitions too early, the brain often confuses intention with accomplishment. The praise we receive releases a subtle reward, a chemical whisper of success, even though no real work has been completed. In that moment, we feel closer to the goal than we truly are. Silence, on the other hand, denies us that premature reward, keeps the tension alive, preserves the hunger. There is something ancient about this. For centuries, monks took vows of silence not because words were evil, but because speech scatters energy. Words spend what silence saves. Consider the craftsman who works quietly in his workshop, telling no one of the masterpiece he is carving. Each day, the secret fuels him. Each stroke of the chisel brings him closer to a vision only he can see. There is no applause to dull his edge. No external validation to replace internal drive. Now contrast that with the person who announces a grand plan at every opportunity. The idea becomes social currency. It earns admiration. It builds identity. I'm writing a novel. I'm launching a company. I'm changing my life. But identity can become a substitute for action. The world begins to treat them as the person they aspire to be, and in that treatment, the pressure to actually become that person diminishes. Elias did not understand this at first. He only knew that his nights felt different. The solitude that once energized him now felt heavy. The building he imagined so clearly began to fracture under invisible expectations. He adjusted the design to make it more acceptable. Straighter lines, safer angles, a more conventional roof. With each compromise, the structure became easier to explain and less extraordinary. It is tempting to believe that sharing dreams makes them real, that speaking them into existence gives them strength. And sometimes, at the right stage, that can be true. But there is a delicate period at the beginning of every vision, a fragile incubation, where exposure can do more harm than good. A seed does not sprout because it is praised. It grows because it is protected. Silence is not weakness. It is containment. It is the disciplined refusal to spend emotional energy on conversation instead of creation. When Elias finally realized what had happened, it was not dramatic. There was no sudden revelation, just a quiet awareness that the building he now drafted was not the one he once dreamed of. The original sketches were still hidden behind the wooden panel, untouched for weeks. He took them out slowly. The paper had curled at the edges. The lines, once bold, seemed almost shy. He stared at them for a long time, and then, without telling anyone, he closed the door to his studio, turned off his phone, and began again, this time in silence. Part 2. There is a difference between secrecy born of fear and silence born of strength. Fearful secrecy hides because it is ashamed. Strong silence protects because it understands value. When Elias returned to his original sketches, he did not feel inspired immediately. The spark did not flare back to life in some cinematic blaze. Instead, he felt something more subtle, a quiet embarrassment. Not because the design was foolish, but because he had diluted it so quickly after sharing it. He began to see how easily outside voices had entered his mind. Not even harsh criticism, just admiration, expectation, curiosity. Even praise can be intrusive when a dream is still forming. He placed the old and new drafts side by side on his long wooden table. The difference was undeniable. The first design was alive with risk. It dared to lean into open space. It invited light in unexpected ways. It asked questions of gravity and tradition. It felt like a conversation between imagination and possibility. The second design was safer, balanced, conventional. It would likely be approved quickly by city officials. It would be easier to explain at dinner parties. It would offend no one, but it would also change nothing. And in that contrast, Elias felt the quiet grief of compromise. How many dreams die not because they are impossible, but because they are prematurely exposed? There is a moment in every creative act, whether building, writing, learning, or transforming, when the vision is still fragile. It has not yet developed structure, cannot defend itself against doubt. It relies entirely on the belief of its creator. During this phase, the mind is especially vulnerable to external influence. A single raised eyebrow can echo louder than a chorus of encouragement. A well-meaning suggestion can reroute months of instinct. And so silence becomes a form of shelter. In the weeks that followed, Elias made a deliberate decision. He would speak of nothing that was not already built. He would announce nothing that was not already solid. When friends asked what he was working on, he smiled and said, "Just a few projects." He did not elaborate. At first, this felt uncomfortable. He had grown used to the subtle satisfaction of describing ambition. Without those conversations, he felt invisible. But invisibility has its advantages. No one expected updates. No one asked for progress. No one offered advice. The dream returned to its original state, unobserved, uninterrupted. Each night he worked quietly. He allowed the structure to regain its boldness. He reintroduced the curves. He reopened the sky-facing spaces. He stopped imagining how others would react and focused instead on what felt true. Slowly, the hunger returned. There is a psychological tension that exists when a goal is kept private. Without public acknowledgement, the only evidence of progress is internal. The only reward is the gradual alignment between effort and vision. This tension can feel heavy at first. Humans are social creatures. We crave affirmation. We want to be witnessed. But something extraordinary happens when the need to be witnessed is replaced by the need to become. The energy once spent explaining the dream is redirected into building it. The mind stops rehearsing speeches and starts solving problems. Elias began to notice small shifts within himself. He felt less defensive about his ideas because he no longer needed to defend them. He felt less urgency to impress because no one was watching. Silence gave him room to experiment. One night, he redesigned the central atrium entirely. He removed structural supports that conventional architects would insist upon and replaced them with a system of counterbalance beams inspired by ship masts along the harbor. It was risky. It might fail, but it felt right. Had he described this idea to his friends over wine, they would likely have questioned its stability. Their concern would have been rational, sensible, and yet that rational concern might have killed the innovation before it had a chance to mature. Silence does not reject feedback forever. It simply delays it until the idea is strong enough to withstand it. There is an old discipline practiced by certain martial artists. Before performing a complex technique in front of others, they repeat it in solitude thousands of times. Not because they fear embarrassment, but because they understand that mastery requires uninterrupted focus. Performance comes later. The modern world, however, encourages the opposite. It invites us to announce intentions at their earliest stage, to document the beginning before we have endured the middle, to collect applause for ambition rather than endurance. Social platforms reward declarations. Starting something new. Big things coming. Watch this space. But declarations are not discipline. Elias felt this tension acutely when one of his friends approached him weeks later. "I haven't heard about your big project," the friend said. "Did you give up?" The question stung more than Elias expected. Part of him wanted to respond with a dramatic description of progress, to prove that he was still ambitious, still visionary. But he resisted. "I'm working," he said simply. The conversation ended quickly. That night, however, he worked with unusual intensity. Not to prove his friend wrong, but to prove something to himself. The quiet doubt had sharpened his focus rather than scattering it. There is a subtle power in being underestimated. When no one expects greatness, there is no pressure to perform prematurely. The work can develop at its natural pace. Mistakes can be made privately. Adjustments can occur without public scrutiny. Contrast this with the person who broadcasts every step of a journey. Each setback becomes a public event. Each delay invites commentary. The dream becomes entangled with reputation. Elias realized that his earlier enthusiasm had transformed his private ambition into a social contract. By speaking too soon, he had unintentionally invited spectators into a process that required solitude. And spectators, even kind ones, change behavior. Over time, the building began to take shape not only on paper but in scale models. He spent hours carving miniature beams, testing balance, adjusting proportions. He studied how light from a single lamp fell across the open roof at different angles. The design regained its courage. It no longer felt like a performance piece, felt like an act of devotion. And yet, something deeper was happening beneath the architecture. Silence was teaching him discipline. He was learning to find satisfaction in progress that no one saw, to trust that unseen effort still mattered, to value growth that produced no immediate recognition. This is perhaps the most difficult lesson of all. In a culture that equates visibility with value, choosing silence can feel like choosing obscurity. But obscurity is often where real transformation begins. Elias began to understand that the building was not only a structure of stone and glass. It was a mirror of his own development. Each decision required him to choose between approval and authenticity. And for the first time, authenticity was winning. As winter approached, the town grew quieter. The summer visitors were gone, the harbor less crowded, the evenings longer and darker. For Elias, the season felt fitting. His work, too, had entered a deeper phase, less visible, more deliberate. The design was no longer just an idea. It had weight now, dimensions, calculations, structural proofs. What had begun as a fragile vision sketched in secrecy was slowly transforming into something that could stand in the physical world. And yet, the temptation to speak returned. It always does. Ambition carries with it a natural desire to be recognized. Not out of vanity alone, but out of a longing to be understood. To say, "This is what I see," and have someone reply, "I see it too." One evening, while reviewing cost estimates at his drafting table, Elias received a message from a former colleague who had moved to the capital city. "I hear you're working on something big," it read. "If it's serious, you should present it to the Urban Development Board. They're looking for fresh ideas. I could mention your name." The offer was generous, strategic, sensible. It also felt premature. The design was strong, but not finished. The calculations were promising, but not final. To present it now would invite scrutiny before the foundation was fully secure. He imagined standing before a panel of experienced architects. He imagined explaining the unconventional roofline, the open atrium, the reliance on light and balance rather than heavy reinforcement. He imagined their questions sharp, logical, necessary. Some of those questions would improve the design. Others might suffocate it. There is a difference between constructive pressure and destabilizing exposure. The challenge is knowing when the structure is ready. Elias did not respond immediately. He closed his laptop and stepped outside into the cold night air. The sky above the sea was clear, stars sharp against the dark. He thought about the building not as a project, but as a promise to himself. A promise to attempt something that felt true, even if it failed. If he rushed it into the public eye too soon, he risked altering its course out of fear. If he waited too long, he risked losing opportunity. Silence is not endless. It is strategic. The key is not to remain hidden forever, but to emerge at the right time. Back inside, he drafted a brief reply. "Thank you. I'm still refining the work. When it's ready, I'll reach out." It was a simple sentence, but behind it stood restraint. Over the next months, Elias refined every detail with an intensity he had never known before. Without the distraction of public validation or criticism, he entered a state of sustained concentration. Hours passed unnoticed. Days blurred into weeks. He began studying historical structures that had defied convention in their time. Cathedrals that seemed impossible until they stood complete, bridges that appeared fragile until they endured storms. He noticed a pattern. Many of these creations were initially doubted. Some were mocked. Others were dismissed as impractical fantasies. But their creators had protected the core vision long enough for it to become undeniable. Not hidden forever, just guarded during its most vulnerable stage. In contrast, he read stories of ideas that had been announced loudly and early, only to fade quietly when execution proved harder than expectation. The enthusiasm of the announcement had replaced the discipline of completion. The difference was rarely talent. It was often timing. One afternoon, Elias visited a construction site in the center of town where a new municipal building was being erected. The project had been widely publicized months before ground was even broken. Renderings were displayed on banners along the street. Speeches had been made. Committees had congratulated themselves. Now, half-built concrete walls stood exposed to wind and rain. Funding disputes had slowed progress. Public opinion had turned critical. What had once been celebrated as visionary was now labeled wasteful. Expectation had outpaced execution. Standing there, watching workers move slowly across scaffolding, Elias felt a renewed clarity. Public commitment can create momentum, but it can also create pressure that fractures under strain. That evening, he returned to his studio and made one final bold adjustment to his design. He removed an entire internal support system and replaced it with a series of load-distributing arches that echoed the curve of the coastline outside his window. It was a risk, but it unified the structure in a way nothing else had. For the first time, the building felt complete. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but coherent. He built a final scale model larger and more detailed than any before. He tested its balance repeatedly. He studied how light filtered through the open roof at different hours. He adjusted minor proportions until they felt inevitable rather than experimental. Weeks passed without a single conversation about the project. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. The dream no longer needed protection. It had matured. It was no longer a fragile idea that could be derailed by a raised eyebrow. It was a structured vision supported by evidence, thought, and endurance. Now, and only now, was it ready to be seen. There is a profound shift that occurs when preparation replaces fantasy. The need for approval diminishes because the work itself carries conviction. External opinion still matters, but it no longer defines direction. Elias contacted his colleague in the capital. "It's ready," he wrote. The presentation was scheduled for early spring. On the morning of his departure, as he packed the scale model carefully into a reinforced case, he felt none of the anxious excitement that had accompanied his first careless announcement months ago. There was no urge to broadcast his plans across the town. No dramatic farewell. He told no one except the client whose commission paid his rent. At the train station, surrounded by commuters absorbed in their own destinations, Elias experienced a quiet steadiness. The silence had done its work. He understood now that speaking a dream too early is like harvesting fruit before it ripens. It may look impressive in your hands, but it lacks nourishment. Cannot sustain you through difficulty. Protected long enough, however, the same fruit becomes strength. As the train began to move, carrying him toward the city and whatever judgment awaited, Elias did not rehearse persuasive speeches in his mind. He reviewed calculations, structural diagrams, light studies. He was not traveling to seek validation. He was traveling to test reality. And that difference changed everything. The capital city greeted him with noise. Steel and glass towers reflected the pale light of early spring. Traffic moved in restless streams. Screens flashed advertisements above crowded sidewalks. It was a place that rewarded visibility, speed, and declaration. For a moment, Elias felt the contrast sharply. In his coastal town, ideas matured slowly, shaped by tide and season. Here, announcements seemed to matter as much as execution. Concepts were pitched before they were proven. Ambition was currency. He carried his model through the wide marble entrance of the Urban Development Board building, its polished floors echoing with footsteps. In the lobby hung renderings of future projects. Sleek, symmetrical, safe. He studied them carefully. They were competent, practical, efficient. They were also predictable. The presentation room was circular, its walls lined with dark wood. A long curved table stood at the center, where board members would sit. Behind them, tall windows framed the skyline. As he set up his model, adjusting its placement under the overhead lights, he felt a familiar flicker of doubt. What if they dismissed it immediately? What if they called it unstable, unrealistic, indulgent? Then another thought surfaced, calmer, steadier. If they rejected it, the rejection would be informed. The design had been tested in silence. It had endured months of scrutiny by its creator. It was no longer fragile. When the board members entered, they greeted him politely. Some were curious, others guarded. One elderly architect leaned forward as soon as the cover was lifted from the model. For a moment, no one spoke. The open roof caught the light from above. The internal arches curved like waves frozen in motion. The atrium drew the eye upward rather than outward. It did not resemble the buildings hanging in the lobby. "Explain your structural reasoning," the chairwoman said finally. There was no praise, no criticism, only a request for clarity. Elias began with the foundations. He described the load distribution, the counterbalance beams inspired by harbor masts, the way the arches transferred weight outward rather than downward. He spoke without theatrical enthusiasm, without overselling. He did not pitch a dream. He presented a solution. Questions followed. Technical, direct. Some were sharper than others. At one point, a younger board member suggested that the open roof would be too costly to maintain. Elias paused before answering. Months ago, that question might have shaken him. It might have triggered defensive improvisation. But now he opened his folder and presented comparative cost projections, long-term maintenance analyses, and environmental data showing reduced energy expenditure due to natural ventilation. Silence had not only protected his vision, it had strengthened it. The discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. When it ended, the chairwoman folded her hands. "This is unconventional," she said, "but it is thorough." There was no dramatic applause, no immediate verdict. The board would deliberate and respond within weeks. As Elias left the building, walking back into the hum of the city, he felt something unexpected. Peace. Whether they approved it or not, the building had already fulfilled its deeper purpose. It had taught him the discipline of restraint, the value of incubation, the strength that grows in solitude. On the train ride home, he watched the landscape shift from urban density to open fields, then to coastline. He thought about how easily this outcome could have been different. Had he continued speaking too soon, adjusting his design to every raised concern, every casual suggestion, the model presented today would have looked like the ones in the lobby. Acceptable, approved, forgettable. Instead, it stood apart. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The board had voted to commission a pilot version of the project for a new cultural center on the edge of the capital. It would not be identical to his original vision, no public project ever is, but the core design would remain intact. The open roof, the curved arches, the light-filled atrium. Elias read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside the wooden panel behind his drafting table, alongside the earliest sketches. He did not rush to the harbor to announce the news. He did not call his friends immediately. He went back to work. There is a quiet irony in success achieved through silence. By the time recognition arrives, the need for it has already diminished. When Elias finally shared the news with his friends weeks later, it was understated. "The board approved a project," he said simply. They were surprised. Some were impressed. A few admitted they had assumed he had abandoned the idea long ago. He smiled but did not elaborate. The true transformation had happened long before the letter arrived. It had occurred in the unseen hours, the nights when he chose drafting over discussion, refinement over recognition. This is the power of silence. It protects the seed until it can survive the wind. It prevents the mind from mistaking applause for achievement. It shifts identity from the person who plans to the person who builds. Many dreams die not because they lack potential, but because they are exposed before they develop roots. They are spoken into rooms that do not understand them. They are celebrated prematurely, draining the hunger required to sustain them. Silence is not secrecy born of fear. It is patience born of wisdom. There will always be a time to speak. But that time is not at the fragile beginning, when the idea depends entirely on belief. Nor is it at the midpoint, when doubt still competes with conviction. It is at the moment when the work can stand on its own. Years later, when the cultural center opened, visitors stood beneath its sweeping arches and open sky. Light moved across the floor just as Elias had once imagined in his quiet studio. Children ran through the atrium. Musicians performed in its acoustically balanced hall. Few people knew how close the design had come to disappearing in its earliest stage. Few understood that its survival depended not on louder promotion, but on deliberate restraint. And that is often the case. The most powerful transformations are built in rooms where no one is watching. They begin in silence. They mature in solitude. And when they finally step into the light, they do not shout. They stand. If you look closely at your own life, you may find a half-built structure somewhere inside you. A book you once planned to write. A skill you promised yourself you would master. A change you swore you would make. Perhaps you spoke about it enthusiastically at first. Perhaps others praised your intention. They told you it was inspiring. They said you would be brilliant at it. And for a while that was enough. But slowly, without drama, the effort faded. Not because the dream was foolish. Not because you were incapable. But because something subtle had shifted. The act of speaking had given you a taste of completion without the labor required to earn it. The applause, however small, replaced the tension that drives endurance. This is not a condemnation of sharing. There are moments when declaring a commitment creates accountability. There are seasons when collaboration strengthens resolve. But there is also a stage, quiet, delicate, easily overlooked, when a dream must remain private in order to survive. Think of the early mornings when no one sees you studying. The workouts completed without posting progress. The business idea refined in notebooks no one reads. The difficult conversations rehearsed silently before they are spoken. These are not empty hours. They are foundational. The world often celebrates visible milestones, the launch, the opening, the announcement. Yet those moments are brief. They are surfaces. The deeper transformation occurs long before anyone claps. Silence forces you to confront yourself. When no one knows what you are attempting, excuses lose their audience. There is no one to impress with potential. No one to distract with plans. There is only the quiet question. Will you continue? It is easier to maintain the identity of someone who intends than to endure the identity of someone who works. Intention is admired. Work is repetitive, invisible, sometimes lonely, but only one of them builds anything. Elias understood this long after his building stood complete. There were new projects offered to him, new opportunities to speak publicly about his vision. Interviews, invitations to panels, requests for insight into his creative process. He accepted some, declined others, but before beginning any new design, he returned to the same ritual. He would close the door to his studio, turn off his phone, draw in silence. He learned that the first sketches of every project were sacred. They were not to be debated, defended, or displayed. Not yet. Over time, people began to describe him as disciplined, focused, reserved. Some called him mysterious. Others assumed he was simply introverted. Few realized that his quietness was not a personality trait. It was a strategy. There is a discipline in withholding what is not yet ready. In an age where exposure is constant, silence becomes radical. When everyone announces beginnings, the one who builds quietly gains an advantage. Not because they hide forever, but because they understand timing. Imagine if every goal you held right now were kept between you and the work itself. No updates, no early celebration, no external pressure, just daily progress. Would you move differently? Would you focus more deeply? Would you be less tempted to adjust your direction based on fleeting opinions? There is a strength that develops when your only witness is your own integrity. Silence sharpens it. Of course, not every dream requires isolation. Some visions thrive on collaboration from the start. Some transformations are strengthened by shared commitment. But even in collaboration, there is an inner silence, a refusal to let noise dictate direction. The power of silence is not in never speaking. It is in choosing when to speak. It is in recognizing that words are powerful, so powerful that they can either reinforce action or replace it. Every time you declare what you will do, you create a version of yourself in the minds of others. And once that version exists, it can either motivate you to become it or satisfy you enough that you stop trying. The difference lies in awareness. If you feel the urge to speak about a goal, ask yourself why. Is it to seek guidance or to seek applause? Is it to build partnership or to build identity? If the answer leans toward applause or identity, consider waiting. Let the work deepen first. Let the idea develop structure. Let your commitment mature beyond excitement. Then, when you speak, your words will carry weight. They will not be promises. They will be evidence. In the end, silence is not about hiding from the world. It is about strengthening yourself within it. Dreams do not die simply because they are spoken. They die when speaking becomes a substitute for doing. They die when validation replaces discipline. They die when identity replaces effort. But protected, nurtured, and developed in quiet persistence, they can grow into something resilient, something capable of withstanding scrutiny and doubt. The next time you feel a new ambition rising within you, resist the immediate urge to announce it. Hold it, examine it, work on it. Let it demand something from you before it earns attention. Because the most powerful transformations are not the ones declared loudly at the beginning. They are the ones revealed calmly at the end. And when that moment comes, when your effort has solidified into reality, you will not need to convince anyone. The work will speak, and it will not whisper. It will stand.